Hello, and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large, coming at you for, well, let's see if this is another hour of power here, podcasting greatness, here on YouTube with video, as well as where all good podcasts are sold. Hey, everybody. Last week in our Critical Conversations live show, I attempted, I think probably poorly, to try to communicate or talk about QAnon. And what is QAnon? Where did it come from? What's it all about? Well, I gave some explanations, but I was kind of flying solo, and I was in the middle of taking phone calls and trying to keep up with a live show. And that's a little bit of a different animal than doing a recorded, pre-recorded here podcast. So here's my stab at it in a podcast format. And this is a complicated and multi-layered subject. I have been deep in the anonymous world for the last couple weeks. I've known about it from the very beginning, going all the way back to 2017 when the whole thing kind of started, because I'd heard rumblings about it and this and that and the other thing. And it was related in a distant way to Anonymous and to the anonymous movement that had started against Scientology back in 2007. And those were activists or hacktivists that did good work. They were doing work against Scientology. And of course, we all like that. And that helped wake me up, helped wake up a bunch of people who were in Scientology. And yet, on reflection and on examining the history and infamous actions that are taken by anonymous computer users, internet users on the boards where Anonymous grew and thrived. And, and none of the people who were around in 2007 are really still around. I mean, there's different sets of people that go through these message boards. And so we're going to talk about this because it has to do with how QAnon started and what QAnon actually is. And how it even could have happened is very reliant on the origin story. The roots of it are very reliant on the darkest, dankest, most horrible parts of the internet that you and I are able to access. I'm not talking here about the dark web, because that's a different thing. That's unindexed, unfindable, very difficult to locate websites or internet locations where you have to know the exact IP address or the exact location of how to get it, because you'll never find those locations on Google. Google just simply doesn't pay attention to or index or make accessible dark web sites. So that's not what we're talking about today. We are talking about things that you can get to, I can get to, anyone can. And that's part of the problem. So we will start our QAnon origin story with, I've got a lot of notes here. And like I said, this is from a cult perspective, from the viewpoint of how I look at and study things. There's a lot of layers to this. There's a lot to know, and many, many different ways of analyzing it. Many frames or lenses we can look at when we look at QAnon. We can look at it as a right-wing extremist group. We can look at it as a, sort of crypto-terrorist kind of activity. We can look at it as simply anonymous people on the internet practicing their freedom of speech, and we can look at it from the freedom of speech and human rights perspective. We can look at it from the cult perspective and the headspace or the mindset that people get into when they go too far down these rabbit holes and get into communities or cultures, little subcultures that develop around these little groups that exist on these rather infamous websites. So QAnon is a movement, is a collective, is a group of people who have a common idea or common belief set. Okay, that's basically what QAnon is. And we'll get into all the specifics of, or many of the base, fundamental specifics of what they believe in. But first off, that's what it is. It's a bunch of people who met or interacted on the internet, found out about this conspiracy theory, and then started piling into being part of this community. And it's a community that very much supports Donald Trump when he was president and then after he left. In fact, Donald Trump is sort of the central figure here. But let's go ahead and talk about origins first. So the first thing we're going to talk about is 4chan. Okay, now you might have heard 4chan. You might have heard of 4chan. You might know everything about 4chan there is to know. You might know more than I do, but I'm assuming, laying this podcast out, we're really only going to cover basics here. We're going to cover the basic origin story, the basic idea of what QAnon is, and how that led to real world violence. This is not just an online activity anymore. And that's one of the most interesting things about it, is that it has made this leap from obscure, dank, dark areas of the internet to YouTube, Reddit, Facebook, mainstream social media platforms and media platforms, and from there into real world gatherings and ultimately the January 6th insurrection. So, and there were other incidents as well of earlier episodes of real world violence or potential violence that also occurred because of QAnon. And this actually builds on earlier things, earlier conspiracies, earlier ideas that had been fostered and developed in the same places where QAnon came from. And again, that's starting off with 4chan. So 4chan is the name of a website. It comes from a series of websites that started with 2chan, meaning channel 2. The channel you'd have to go to in order to get to the cable access or internet, whatever. It was the name of a site, 2chan, and then there was 3chan, then 4chan, and 4chan was and is an open forum, kind of a lot like Reddit. It's image messaging, or you can share images, memes, graphics with one another, as well as text messages. Everybody on 4chan is anonymous. You do not have to register with any ID, any name. Even the server guys, the moderators and the administrators and the people who run the site don't know who all the users are. You don't have to give them your personal information. So you go on there, anybody goes on there, and they can say and do whatever they want, and there's very, very, very tiny chance that you would ever be discovered or found out or doxxed or unmasked in your anonymity. So and the idea with 4chan is that it was supposed to be the wild, wild west, wide open. Anybody can say anything about anything they want. And the way it organizes is there's various boards or subgroups, similar to Reddit or even Facebook, where you have pages or groups. You have these forums or these sub threads or sub areas where people can go. I'm mixing a little bit of terminology there, but basically forums where you can go, and these are by subject matter. So you might have cute animal puppies, and you might have lizards, and you might have incorrect politics, and you might have one concentrated on fat people and fat shaming, and not against fat shaming, but actively doing fat shaming, sharing memes, sharing pictures of fat people, making fun of them, overweight, obese people, etc. So you can have anything appear on these boards, and anything has appeared on 4chan. And there is a degree of moderation that occurs, and there are law enforcement that can oversee these sites and do from time to time. And so when some kinds of material gets posted there, the webmasters or the administrators might be contacted and told in no uncertain terms, that's illegal, that needs to come down right now, at which time they will usually do exactly that because they don't want to be shut down. And that's that's kind of a threat. In the United States, we have some of the most liberal freedom of speech laws or protections anywhere in the world. And I think too much, but that's really an individual call at this point. And so a lot of these Chan sites are hosted in the United States as opposed to other countries. But there are places where, things have gone hosted to other countries. Point is, it's wide open. People say anything they want. And a lot of what they have to say on these boards and in these sites is pretty disgusting, pretty gross stuff. Really offensive in many, many ways. You know, dark jokes, racism, misogyny, sexism. I mean, all the things we sort of rail against in mannered, normal, regular society, they thrive on. They live for it. They revel in their anti-establishment, anti-group, anti-society kind of free for all that they get to have there. And people who are in a frame of mind that they want to share their deepest, darkest, most horrible thoughts will go there and do that. And that's what those sites are about. So you get the idea from, I'm hoping you get the idea from this that these are places where you would not want to have children, let's say. And yet children can register there very easily. There is no guarantee, there is no safety net, there is no anybody trying to make sure that the users of 4chan or 8chan or these other boards are having a safe experience, are having you know, in any way catered. Okay, there's none of that. No controls. There's no child controls, anything like that. Unless I said like law enforcement or something contacts these guys. The people who set up and run these things are free speech absolutists. They believe that everybody should have the right to say whatever they want, whenever they want, however they want, and damn the consequences. And this is truly where they come from. And it's a pretty bizarre headspace because it's probably the most egotistical. It's one of the most egotistical headspaces I've ever seen. It is purely driven by, you know, my freedoms, my desires, my need to communicate my darkest, deepest, most horrible things that I could possibly say or share is my right, and how dare you have anything to say about it or try to stop me. Fair enough, but there are consequences, and there are real world consequences that come from this. And when you allow unfettered, uncensored, uncontrolled sharing of information amongst people, well, this is our laboratory experiment for what happens. And what happens is some pretty dark stuff. Okay, so in terms of this, there's a Washington Post article here, which I thought I would share with you guys, that talks about who uses 4chan. According to the site's own statistics, the vast majority of its users are young, college-educated men with an interest in Japanese culture, video games, comics, and technology. Most live in English-speaking countries, the United States, Great Britain, Canada, and Australia, but the site also sees sizable traffic from Germany, Sweden, and France. In late 2010, a 4chan user conducted a wholly unscientific survey of other site users, which found that, amongst other things, most 4chan users don't discuss the site offline, and most users wouldn't let their kids join it. So there are, in terms of why is 4chan important? Well, it's where QAnon was literally born. Okay. But it's not the only thing that's come out of 4chan. There's a history here, and the backstory is kind of important because it sets the stage in a very specific way, because the stage is a pretty unique place. This isn't like Facebook or Reddit or places you're more familiar with. It's different. It's unfettered. It's uncensored. So anything goes. And when you allow young white men to have at it with anything goes, this is the kind of thing they produce. Celebgate, which was the leak of dozens of stolen celebrity nude photos, no longer available on 4chan, but they exist as downloadable. But all that started on 4chan, sharing, pictures, private pictures, hacked from celebrity phones and celebrity computers, of private, intimate photos that they took that they did not intend for public consumption. Well, they didn't care. We were going to share the hell out of this. Then there's Gamergate. Now, if you guys have ever heard, and Gamergate's a huge subject, and I'm only really skimming it here by saying, again, reading this description from the Washington Post, that Gamergate was an ongoing movement to expose quote unquote corruption in video game journalism, which was drummed up by 4chan users. Now, again, this is a bunch of young guys really pissed at females and female gamers specifically speaking up about gender inclusion and equality in video games. You might have noticed that, a lot of women in video games are scantily clad, for example. Some women objected to this, and these gamers and 4chaners decided that they needed to be taught a lesson, that these upstart females who were daring to speak up and push against the establishment norms of the male-dominated gamer industry needed to be pushed back into the kitchen and shut the fuck up. So they decided that they would cyberstalk, harass, dox, and otherwise abuse as well as they could and as heavily as they could. And they really piled on to certain women and men who tried to also ally with that. And there were lives ruined, there were careers destroyed, there was money lost, and there was a great deal of controversy connected with all of this. This was Gamergate, okay? Even more despicable, if you can imagine this, because this, if you even take the mildest look into Gamergate, you're going to see the morality and the lack of a moral compass that most 4chaners seem to revel in. It's a sort of a group collective awful, and this is something that sociologists and psychologists have been studying and known about. Story writers have written about it before psychologists were even studying it. I mean, you can see old Twilight Zone episodes and experiments and group activities, etc., that show how we can rile each other up and how an individual can enter into this situation who is not riled up and get riled up and become an awful person when they weren't necessarily before. This group influence and peer pressure and the group free-for-all of it all can be quite heady. It can be quite a intoxicating experience. And when you're in the middle of it, you think it's just this, consequence-free, wonderful ride with no real, nobody's really getting hurt. What's the big deal? I'm just, sharing pictures. I'm just throwing memes around. But when it starts getting into the heavier duty stuff, and these cyber mobs are easily pushed into the heavier stuff, then it gets real ugly really fast, and there are real world consequences. For example, there was the cyberbullying of a girl, 11 years old, named Jessie Slaughter. That was her name. And one of the earliest high-profile incidents of cyberbullying in which 4chan members sent death threats and calls to an 11-year-old girl who would later make multiple suicide attempts. Okay, real-world consequences come from cyberbullying, and these guys really don't care. They think it's great. They think it's wonderful. If somebody were to kill themselves as a result of the cyberbullying campaign that 4chan executed, that forum would erupt in joyous wonderment. They thought that was the greatest thing ever. So we're talking about people who are not like you and me. They are turned into something else, or they already were something else before they arrived there, and they were drawn to that because of that. Okay, these are extremely antisocial, extremely evil activities that go on these boards. This is not just fun and games and haha, isn't this a cute meme of this fat person. This is a lot darker. And this is the boiling pot where QAnon arose. Okay. So I think I've given you the idea, and you can look this stuff up. I'll see about posting this link in the show notes here to today's show, so you can check out some of this stuff for yourself. But first, we needed to establish what 4chan was, and that's what it is. Now, another activity that occurs on 4chan, which is kind of weird, but it apparently is a thing, is called LARPing, L-A-R-P, live action role-playing. And what this means in the context of a message board like 4chan is people are anonymous. Nobody knows who anybody else is. So they can be anybody. You could be interacting with another, with a 12-year-old who's living in his mom's basement, exactly according to the stereotypes. Even though that's not really the stereotypical 4chaner, but you could be interacting with a 12-year-old, or you could be interacting with a 50-year-old government official. You could be interacting with a Wall Street major trendsetter. You could be interacting with a housewife in Montana. You could be interacting with literally anyone. So some of these people will present themselves as government officials, as high up federal officials, FBI agents, CIA officers, case officers, and they go by names like FBI Anon. So I'm FBI Anon. That means I'm an FBI agent, or I'm representing myself as an FBI agent, and this is my name, and this is who I am. And you don't know if this person's an FBI agent or not, but they probably aren't. And in fact, the chances are very, very, very high that they are not. And so what you're dealing with there is a role player, somebody who is live action role playing. He is pretending to be this FBI guy, and he's posting messages and saying things as though he is this, or she is this FBI officer or CIA agent or whatever. So this activity was already happening on these boards before QAnon ever came along, before this Q person ever came along. And Q Clearance Patriot was the full name of the individual who started posting these drops that we now call Q drops, and which we later shortened this Q Clearance Patriot name down to simply Q. And Q Clearance Patriot presented themselves, or role playing, as a government official within Donald Trump's inner circle who had a Q level security clearance. Now, if you haven't heard of a Q level security clearance up until this whole thing, that's not unusual, because it's a clearance, it's a top secret security clearance that exists in the Department of Energy. So not a whole bunch of people have Q clearance. And it's very, very likely that this person who's posing as Q, or is presenting themselves as Q, is not somebody who has any real top secret clearance. They never provided any real information or credentials that proved that that was true. Okay. And no one has really totally proven or nailed down who Q is. That's a question I'm not going to get into in this podcast, because frankly, I don't really care at this point. There is a whole HBO documentary you can watch it's called Q, Coming of the Storm or something like that. And that is basically one man's hunt for who Q is. And if you want to know a lot more and actually see in graphic detail what the 4chan and these other boards are about that Q was born in, then I recommend watching that documentary, because you'll get an eyeful, and you will get more than an eyeful, and then you'll get even more. And as I have been, you will be convinced that these boards are some of the worst cesspools of human gatherings that have ever existed. These places are really toxic. Okay, so LARPing is something that occurs there, and I needed to talk about that because Q is a LARPer. Q is somebody who is pretending to be, in all likelihood, none of this can be said with 100% certainty, but given the fact that there is absolutely no evidence that this has been going on since 2017, no one's come forward and claimed to have been Q openly. Every single person who has ever been accused of it has denied it. And so we don't know, really who this person actually is. There are good guesses and there is good conjecture, and maybe in future episodes we'll cover some of that. But I don't think that's important for what we're trying to do right now, because Q is not a central cult leader in the same way L. Ron Hubbard is, or in the same way that Jim Jones was. It's a bit of a different thing. And I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit with that because I don't want to go too far ahead. We'll get to the cult characteristics of this and how this does fit certain cult modeling in a really, really unique and interesting way. And it's really the development of this and and how this thing kind of went from obscure to mainstream and how it's evolved. That's the most interesting part of this whole thing, as far as I'm concerned. And the membership of this group is of far more interest to me than the leadership of the group. Okay. So you had Gamergate happen. Now, another thing that developed on 4chan before Q came along was something called Pizzagate. And Pizzagate you might have heard about or heard discussed. It was a controversy generated around the leak. There was a hack done of the Democratic National Committee's emails. John Podesta, name you might have heard, was the head or chairman of the DNC, and his emails were hacked. And there was a big dump of them, and there was a lot of emails. And in sifting through those emails, these bright bulbs on 4chan decided, or somebody decided, that every time there was a lot of comments throughout the email dump. These guys like ordering pizza, and so there were mentions throughout in various emails between people at the DNC about ordering pizza. And some bright bulb decided that this was code, right? These guys are people who are really into trying to see beyond and figure things out and get to the real story behind things, even when there is no real story and they're just making shit up. This is a world where there are no consequences and where nobody can really hold you accountable for anything you say. You know, I mean, every user, every person who's on these boards has a unique ID, so we know that from one day to the next, this is the same person posting this stuff, but you don't know anything about the person. So they're free to do whatever or say whatever they want without any fear of retribution or real world consequence. Unless they were to get doxxed or unmasked or somebody were to find out who they were, right? But that's really hard to do. It's really hard to do. It's not like you can get an app or you can call somebody or something like that. It's hard, okay? So there is a real guarantee and expectation by the users of these groups that nobody's ever gonna know what they're saying. And as we know from research on this, these guys don't talk about this in the real world with other people. They keep it to themselves. This is their little secret. And it should be, because this stuff's pretty awful. So anyway, Gamergate is where somebody decided that every time they mentioned pizza in these emails, what they were actually talking about was a child. A child was being ordered by these bunch of pedophiles, see? Because the DNC is made up of a bunch of pedophiles. In fact, Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton and all their friends and all their connections are all a bunch of pedophiles. And this has been an accusation that is completely, doesn't really have any founding in fact other than the connection to Jeffrey Epstein. Okay, so there are connections in some of this that are drawn from real world connections that could be something. But then, like Scientology, they'll take this one possible maybe piece of maybe evidence, say it's absolutely true, swear on any number of Bibles that it's absolutely true, and then build from that. And that's an important little sequence of events right there, because that's how QAnon happened. Is there were all these ideas about pedophiles and the deep state, this sort of shadow hidden government that really runs things. And it doesn't really matter which administration is in power. The deep state are the guys who really run things in Washington. This kind of thinking, right? It's very, very simplistic, conspiracy-minded kind of thinking. And there's all kinds of reasons why people get into that. Not going to really get into that right now, but this idea of taking a half truth or a sort of wondering truth or an assumption about something, and then treating it as an absolute fact and building on it and building an entire mythology off of this one piece of false or maybe somewhat true information, and then going and building this whole thing off of it. This is a common thing. This happens all the time on these boards. Especially in the realm of this politics and the deep state. So this idea of a deep state existed, the idea that the Clintons and others in the DNC or in the liberal left are a bunch of pedophiles and actually Satan worshipers. I mean, there's all kinds of crazy stuff that gets forwarded here and shared as though it's true. Some of this stuff probably starts as jokes too. But these are not a whole lot of mentally stable people. I mean, I hope we're clear on the fact that the people who are drawn into this either start off a little broken or very broken, or they get broken in the process. Because you can't be exposed to the kind of deranged nonsense that goes on these boards for any length of time and not get damaged, basically. I mean, I'm just saying that. It's my opinion, but it's pretty bad, right? And like I said, if you want to go check it out for yourself or look at some of the stuff that gets shared, we're talking about Nazi stuff, we're talking about anti-Semitic stuff, we're talking about throw them in the ovens with pictures of doing so, we're talking about child rape, we're talking about a lot of really dark stuff that gets joked about as though it's no big deal. Okay. So some of these ideas were fostering or brewing on this board before Q ever came along. And Q actually didn't just show up one day and start being believed. Q was just another anonymous poster, just Q Clarence Patriot. Okay, Q, here's this guy, right? Just like FBI anon and CIA anon, LARPing on the boards as though they're some government official and making, weird statements and message drops to try to entice other people or get them to figure out what they're saying or something like that. So in I think it's October 2017 is when Q famously drops the first of what ended up being something on the order of 5,000 Q drops, Q messages on 4chan. And that activity continued. Those 5,000 posts were between October of 2017 and December 2019. Q hasn't posted anything since December 2019 after Trump lost and left office. So we haven't heard, so Q's kind of disappeared now, just so you know. But the QAnon movement has continued, and it's fractured, it's factioned, it's split, it's that, the other problem. I mean, there's a ton of stuff going on there. It's not just some simplistic, monolithic activity. It's not that simple, because what we're dealing with here is an online community that in some ways has translated into the real world, but it's also stayed online in a number of ways. So it's complicated. There's a lot of layers to this, right? Okay, so I got a lot of notes here, and I'm just kind of skimming through because I don't want to just read to you guys the whole time. Okay, now Q started on 4chan, and after a certain period of time, and I don't have all the dates, I don't have the whole timeline worked out here, but after a certain period of time, 4chan started moderating or messing with Q's posts, and Q didn't like that, and moved to 8chan. Now, 8chan was started by a guy named Fred, and he's in the documentary, and you can see him. He has actually, since starting 8chan, he kind of created it as an alternative to 4chan because 4chan was getting too controlled, too moderated. Everything I've described to you was going on 4chan, and these guys thought that's not enough. I want to be able to say anything I want. So this guy, Fred, started 8chan, and 8chan became the place where Q moved to. And Q brought his followers at that point. He had developed followers, and people were now into this whole Q drop thing of taking his cryptic messages and decoding them. And we'll get to that in a second. But it went from 4chan to 8chan, okay? And then, interestingly, the guy who was, after a few years, the guy who was running 8chan, who started it, sold it to a guy named Ron Watkins and continued moderating it. But after about 2 years, got really burnt out. 2 or 3 years, I guess. And he said in the documentary that, he was a free speech absolutist until he saw what people were doing with it. And I believe that it was very obvious that moderating that over the period of a couple of years took an incredible psychological toll on this guy. I don't think, he ever imagined what people really were going to do with unfettered free speech. So, and he saw all of it because he was moderating these boards. He was the decision point as to what stayed and what didn't. Or again, maybe they got calls, I can't remember, from law enforcement that they would have to take certain things down. But anyway, he did not seem too impressed by the whole thing. And after a certain period of time, he actually started pushing back and insisted that 8chan be shut down. And that was when it was renamed or changed over to 8kun, Kun. And this was done by Ron Watkins and his son, who now run and operate 8kun. So basically still the same thing. Unfettered free speech absolutism, here we go. As this has been exposed, there have been times when it's gone down, when there have been issues and problems, and this has gone into the mainstream in a pretty big way. This stuff was never meant to be mainstream news. These guys were not creating these boards. The people who go to these boards were not expecting to be blown up to the big, huge mainstream media stage. But Q was a little different because Q started something on 4chan that had been kind of different and unique. Gamergate and Pizzagate had been earlier kind of similar incarnations of community gathering of awful, where a whole bunch of these guys got together at once and decided, we're going to take down these female gamers, or we're going to take out this Comet Ping Pong pizza place where they have pedophiles in the basement. Remember that guy from North Carolina who took a gun and went to Washington, D.C. and went to Comet Ping Pong and walked in there, guns ablazing, ready to start shooting pedophiles because he thought that they were in the basement of this Comet Ping Pong place. This is the place where the DNC had been ordering their pizzas from. In other words, to this guy's twisted worldview, this is the place where they were running a child pedophilia ring, and he was going there to get some justice and free these kids. Well, imagine his surprise when he shows up in there brandishing weapons, walking around, take me to your basement. And they say, dude, we ain't got a basement. There is no basement. And everything he'd been reading was complete horseshit. And this guy went to jail. I mean, you don't get to walk into a pizza place brandishing weapons and threatening people and not have consequences. And he very quickly realized what a fool he was. And that's when that's one of many incidents. There was also an incident on Hoover Dam where a guy shut down traffic for a while, came out there, guns, brandishing weapons, again, from this Q thing, if I remember that right. So, okay. So Q moved from 4chan to 8chan to 8kun. And by December 2019 had ceased posting altogether. But Q was the main component of 8chan and 8kun that actually really got them popularized and going, because Q was developing a following now. There was a conspiracy theory made up of all of these different elements that had kind of already existed there, but Q started putting them together in a way that had appeal to people, where other efforts and attempts to put these things together in other ways hadn't appealed to people in a similar way. Somehow this kind of twist caught on. And Q's original post was that Hillary Clinton was being arrested, and the extradition was actually happening, and she was going to Gitmo in the next few days. And this was going to be released, and this was going to be a thing. And this was in October 2017. Well, Hillary Clinton was not arrested. That never happened, and it was never going to happen. But that didn't stop the people on this board from doubling down on the claim and then further claims and more claims and more claims. But Q's claims would come in these very cryptic drops, these messages. And these were very strange. They were oddly worded. They were cryptic. They had numbers and letters and weird things connected with them. And like I said, there were over 5,000 of these, or almost 5,000 of them. So like L. Ron Hubbard's lectures, this is a prolific poster. There would be days where there could be 3, 4, 5 postings, and then maybe a day of none, and then another day of 12 postings, and then, a couple days of only 1, and then maybe none for a while. So it was infrequent how often Q was hitting these boards and dropping these messages. But after this was established as a thing, and Q became this reputable source of cryptic knowledge that he was now spreading to the 4chan board. And quickly they created their own board and their own little world. They took it. It went from the politics board to its own board, and they started on. And that's when this thing really started gaining steam. Then, then it went to YouTube. There was a South African 4chaner who was following this very closely, totally convinced Q was real, nobody was talking about, and a couple other people, and they took the Q messaging and the Q conspiracy to a YouTuber, a woman, Diaz, and I think Patrick or Patricia or something like that. And she started talking about it on YouTube. She didn't have a huge channel, but it started gaining YouTube attention. It went from the cesspool of the internet to a mainstream, the most popular video sharing platform in the world. And so she didn't have a huge channel, but she had enough influence and enough viewers that the YouTube algorithm picked it up and started recommending Q-based content to all the usual suspects, the conspiracy theorists, the flat earthers, the Alex Jones types, started seeing these Q videos, and it started building a bigger following of people who had never been to 4chan or 8chan or 8kun, never wanted to be. But they wanted to find out more about Q, so they went there. And they started following these message drops. And what developed is one of the most fascinating things about this entire movement. It became interactive. And by that, I mean that with a group like Jim Jones or Scientology or Om Shinrikyo or these other cults, you have a centralized leadership, a man or a woman or a group of people who are calling all the shots, making all the rules, laying down the mythology, laying down the truth. And they are the source of the truth. But in Q drops are the source of the truth, but it's a truth you have to figure out. He's not just using plain speak. And so the Q drops would have to be translated. And so what developed is a kind of ecosystem and a hierarchy of Q followers where some of them became what are called bakers. And this is just so weird. So what the bakers would do is they would take the Q drop as soon as it would come down, like maybe that day there was a Q drop. Okay, good, boom, right? And these bakers would start looking up and finding potential answers or potential connections or dot connecting to what Q was saying and what he was predicting or what he was talking about. And Q was saying things like, there are no coincidences. This is not a game, but this is a game. I mean, there was a lot of psychological language manipulation going on here. It's a whole nother level of analysis of this that we're not going to get into today. But Q's cryptic messages would need to be interpreted, and the bakers, the self-appointed Q followers who said, I can figure out what this guy is saying, and I'm going to go look and find and see what could potentially be an answer or an interpretation of this Q drop, and then I'm going to share it with the rest of the community. And basically, the community is the one who decides through their votes, it's not a formal process, but the bakers would drop their idea of what these crumbs meant. The Q drops would have crumbs in them, and the bakers would take the crumbs and turn it into bread, okay, is kind of the wording that they used. And so, and then Q would often, in later drops, verify, confirm, or deny the translations or the interpretations. So sometimes these would work out and go in the direction he wanted it to, and other times it would go in some other direction, and he didn't really comment on it one way or the other. And other times he'd say, no, that's not right. What I meant was this. So it was, and there's, like I said, in 5,000, almost 5,000 drops, you got a lot being said. But this ecosystem that developed is interesting because it was almost religious in a way, in that you had these bakers who were really kind of acting as conduits or interpreters of the divine messaging. And the messaging was vague enough and weird and cryptic enough that it could have multiple meanings. So which one's right? Well, let's see what they all have to say, and let's kind of, through community crowdsourcing, they're kind of voting in what the next element of the mythology is going to be, or what the next predicted event is going to be, or what the next part of the conspiracy is going to be. Yeah, pretty weird stuff. Now, the conspiracy theory that developed from this is, well, it's wild. And I'm just going to read you a summary of the basic fundamental of what the Q conspiracy is. This has been contributed to by, at this point, thousands of people, and has gone off in lots of different directions. There is not a single unified Q conspiracy mythology that everybody agrees with. There's lots of different tangents and ideas with this, but there are certain fundamental principles of the conspiracy that always seem to be true or aren't argued about very often, and that's basically what this breakdown or summary of this is. Okay, here we go. With the aid of a small group of military intelligence officers called the Q Team, one or more of whom is supposedly responsible for writing the drops. Oh yeah, see, it could be possible that Q is more than one person. It could be a team of people. There have been allusions to that even in some of his drops. So it's not necessarily true that it's just one guy. So with the aid of a small group of military intelligence officers called the Q Team, President Donald Trump is waging a shadow war against a cabal of Satan-worshipping, child-eating pedophiles who are conspiring to obstruct and overthrow him. The military will arrest them en masse in an event called The Storm. If you've heard of Q and the coming storm, or the storm is coming, that's what they're talking about. The cabal's membership has grown in the telling. At first, it was many in our government, quote unquote. Then, within a month, it was any celebrities who had supported Hillary Rodham Clinton, or HRC, and they might well be in on it. And a few months later, there were just too many people to fit into Guantanamo Bay. There were so many people who were involved in this sex ring, child-eating, Satan-worshipping cabal. And later still, 3 other detention centers were being prepped. Okay, this is the kind of thing Q would say, is detention centers are being prepped. Preparations are being made. Hillary's about to be arrested. Watch for this. Watch for this. Look at this. What do you think this means? I mean, all real world activities were being commented on, but Q would introduce little twists and turns into it. And then the community would respond to this by interactively figuring out what he was talking about and coming up with their own mythology. Okay, and this is the mythology that they came up with, is there were so many of these people in the government that they weren't even going to fit in Guantanamo Bay, and they were prepping 3 more detention centers. And it would be fair to say that virtually anyone who's ever angered or defied President Trump is considered part of the cabal, along with the usual suspects like philanthropist George Soros, who is one of the favorite whipping boys of the anti-Semitic conspiracy crowd. They hate on George Soros 24/7, as well as any other Jews. They call out Jews in Hollywood. They call out Jews in power. They're really no better than Louis Farrakhan when it comes to that. In fact, the rhetoric is almost exactly the same as Louis Farrakhan's rhetoric. And of course, You should be familiar with Farrakhan at this point. He's the guy who heads up the Nation of Islam, which is one of the most anti-Semitic hate groups I've ever encountered, and they are staunch allies of the Church of Scientology. Okay. So, QAnon's history here is a little different because, like I said, they jumped to YouTube. And this, of course, resulted in the mainstreaming of QAnon, where it became merched. I mean, YouTubers get hold of this, and suddenly it becomes an income opportunity, right? And a number of YouTubers stepped up and started presenting themselves as QAnon bakers, as interpreters of the sacred lore and the sacred knowledge that was being passed down by Q. So, and you had here the interesting situation that some of their interpretations would be commented on or confirmed or denied by Q, and others wouldn't be. And so you had a potential interaction with God, you know, with the source of the Holy Scriptures. This again, you know, for people like you and me who are outside of this looking in on it, we go, that's whack, that's crazy. How are they, what? But people in this headspace, this is like being acknowledged by your favorite celebrity, by your favorite movie star, by your favorite, you know, a sports figure. You know, he's listening to what I have to say. He's paying attention to me. And then, of course, the other thing about this is that Q is not the savior figure. Q is the person who is dropping the truth, but it's Donald Trump who is the savior figure. This is a really important point of this, because Q is not the cult leader. Donald Trump is. He's the one who's going to be the savior figure, and he is presented in an iconic way as this perfect specimen of humanity who is leading the charge against the cabal of Satan-worshiping pedophiles. Okay, keep in mind, this is where a lot of these, you know, really whack pictures and images and memes of Trump as Rocky and Trump as George Washington, where they take Trump's face and they superimpose it over these heroic figures. This is where this crap comes from. These people are worshiping Donald Trump as a savior figure, and they believe that he is actually going to bring about a new world order, so to speak. You know, they don't use NDO because that's conspiracy talk, but they basically have that concept. This is an apocalyptic savior belief set where there is a, you know, very, very similar to Christianity. And, you know, why would that be? Well, you've definitely got a Christian component connected up with this. And I'm not going to get, again, that's just another layer of analysis of this. It's not the driving force. It's not that everybody's a Christian and that's why they're part of QAnon. It's just another layer of QAnon. And it happens to be an analysis point of the conspiracy theory that came out of all of this, is that Donald Trump is your savior figure. And so the evangelicals were able to connect with this right away because they'd already developed their own Donald Trump as savior figure mythology. So they were plugged right in with QAnon. You know who else connected up with QAnon? The neo-Nazis. You know who else connected up with QAnon? The flat earthers. Who else? The Proud Boys. The patriots. I mean, the oath keepers. I mean, all these sort of neo-Nazi, white supremacist, you know, Christian nationalist groups started feeding into this conspiracy theory once it became mainstream. Not all these people were going around on the 4chan, 8chan boards. They were watching YouTube. They were on Reddit. Q actually did an AMA on Reddit and asked me anything. I think he only answered about 12 questions of any importance, but you know, this had a growing, thriving community on Reddit, on Facebook. There were Facebook groups, Facebook pages put together to follow all of this and keep up with the Q drops. See, the Q drops and the interactive sort of role-playing aspect of this is really, really crucial to understanding why people got so sucked into it. Is I mentioned LARPing earlier as an activity that occurred on the boards, but in a way, all the QAnon followers were LARPing because they were live action role playing as though they were part of this movement of people who were going to actually save the world. Sound familiar? Right? And again, you can get into quite a heady, quite a dopamine-filled headspace. You can get quite euphoric, quite high, quite sure of yourself, quite, full of yourself and your importance if you think you're on a mission to save the world. If you think what you're doing is actually exposing the dark, deep underbelly, the criminal element, the disgusting Satan-worshiping element of the people in power. Why is your life so rough? Why are the economics so bad? Why is it you have to get vaccinated? Why is it that the world seems to be going to hell? Well, it's all these child, eating, Satan-worshiping pedophiles. And Donald Trump's going to save us from all of them. And look at all this evidence, right? Because as these Q drops were interpreted and turned into bread, they would then start looking for real world proof that what they were saying was true. And as you know, from Flat Earth, from 9/11 truthers, from any conspiracy theory, from anti-vaxxers, you can twist reality and corrupt facts and make fiction into fact just like that. It's nothing. It's easy. It's the easiest thing for the human mind to do, to drum up facts to support a belief. We do it every single day of the week. We do it every single hour of every single day we're alive. We rationalize and justify our feelings, our beliefs, our ideas. They're ours. They're special. They're unique. They're our special things, and we have to protect them and hold on to them, right? Because ideas are scarce and beliefs are sacred. When you start thinking this way, then these things become really important and they can become grossly exaggerated beyond all proportion. And that's what happens in these conspiracy headspaces, because people start getting on this into this sort of purpose-minded, mission-minded frame of mind that they're doing important work. And if you don't believe me, you're part of the problem, right? It gets in-group, out-group immediately, right? We have the sacred knowledge. We have the loaded language. We have the special truth. And I'm inviting you in to become part of it. And if you call me crazy, I know there's something wrong with you. That's the Q headspace. That's the conspiracy headspace. It's the cult headspace. And QAnon is no exception to that. But without a central leader and without Donald Trump ever actually stepping up and saying, I'm Q. See, he's taken advantage of this by using the mindset, the extremist mindset of these people to his advantage. All he cares about with them is getting their money or getting their votes or having them keep him out of trouble. That's Donald Trump's approach to all of this. So the whole QAnon thing is something that he wants to leverage to his advantage because he wants to leverage everything to his advantage. And it just so happens that in this belief set, he's the savior figure, in the same way that he's the savior figure for the Trump supporting evangelicals. So he's going to leverage that as much as he can to use that to his advantage. So we come to January 6th, right? Let's fast forward now. January 6th, 2021. This year, we had a very nice insurrection. How did that happen? Well, a bunch of these groups, a bunch of these people came together in Washington, D.C. to, stop the steal. Hashtag stop the steal. We're gonna go protest, and we're gonna stop this injustice of Donald Trump not being reelected. We're gonna stop that. They're stealing the election. And Trump himself went out and talked to these people and said, you go up to that Congress building, you go up to that Capitol building, and you tell them what's what, and you fight for the truth, because the truth is I didn't lose this election, and they're trying to steal it from me. And you go on up there and you tell them what's what, right? And then Donald Trump retreated to the White House and watched in glee as these people marched up the street to the Congress building, busted into it as a mob, and you've seen the video. And if you haven't seen the video, well, check out the video. It was an insurrection. And at this point, hundreds of people have been arrested and have been identified and are being arrested who were taking part in this, because it was straight up treason and an insurrection, an attempt to actually overthrow the government of the United States. That is what those people were doing there. And don't let any of their backpedaling and explanations and rationalizations for it fool you. That is why they were there, and lives were lost as a result on both sides, unfortunately. Ashley Babbitt famously was a woman who was radicalized online. She was a former vet. She was a veteran, former military, from former Air Force, and she was in San Diego, running a business, housewife, and she got radicalized over the course of 2 years online, starting with winners like Alex Jones and Candace Owen and Fox News, and diving quickly into the Q mythology and going full on into that. And her name is important because, of course, she was one of the people who stormed the Capitol, and she got shot and she died completely needlessly for an absolute waste. Her life ended up being an absolute waste because, or her death at least, because she died for a complete lie. And that's a real world consequence. An insurrection is a very serious real world consequence. This is not just people sharing idle memes on a message board because they have their freedom of speech. That's the root, the seed from which grew all of this. So that's the basic story of QAnon and the basic origin of it. I can and probably will do more podcasts. I would actually like to find some folks I've already identified who know a lot more about this than I do. And like I said, I've had my head in this for weeks, and there's just so much to know. And it's a constantly changing and evolving thing. This is still going on, you see. QAnon is still a movement that's happening. And while it might have fractured and factioned and split up here and there, it's still going. So this is not just a thing that happened in the past, it's still happening. The fact that there hasn't been any Q drops all year is fascinating. And the fact that the movement's sort of, wandering about and sort of not knowing really what to do with itself is fascinating. I said at the beginning of the year, it's going to be fascinating one way or the other what happens with this, whether Trump wins or loses the election, whether he, ever claims responsibility for any of this, whether anybody steps up and says, I'm Q, But at this point, see, the movement has sort of gone past Q. It's kind of, it's its own sort of thing. The people who are part of this didn't stop trying to figure out what's going on, try to interpret modern events, try to contact Donald Trump, try to, make things happen. They're still doing that work, even though there are no more Q drops, as I understand it. And, that could change tomorrow. Between the time I'm recording this podcast and the time I'm posting it, Q could drop something. Wouldn't that be interesting? So who knows, right? Who knows? On the other hand, I personally believe that whoever was responsible for Q saw January 6th and decided, yeah, I don't think I want to be part of any of the consequences of that. So, maybe that's why we haven't heard anything more from this person, or there could be 100 other reasons. Don't take my word for it. I'm just conjecturing. But we don't even know who this person is, right? But they are not the leader of this thing, and it's this that I'd like to comment on to finish this podcast off, is that what you see with QAnon is probably the epitome of the online cult model that we're probably going to be seeing more of in the future. Because if Q organically, accidentally sort of started this whole thing, and that is how it happened, is it just sort of, it was a twist of circumstances and memes and ideas that kind of magically coalesced into a perfect storm. Pardon the expression, but it kind of fits here, into all of this awful. it could easily happen again. Right circumstances, right people, right messaging. Boom, we've got another one. So this kind of modeling is not the easiest thing to generate or create if you want to be a cult leader. But as I mentioned in recent Q&As, cult leaders often are, opportunists. They are, they are taking advantage of an existing context or situation and leveraging it in their direction. And it was really just kind of an accident that it happened. But once they start leveraging things in their direction, it becomes easier and easier as more and more people get on board and more people are agreeing with what they're saying or pushing or doing. So that could easily happen again. And we're not like at all out of the woods or QAnon's no big deal or anything like that. There's an intensive amount of study that still needs to be done on this, is being done on this. There's a number of articles. Academic work is just really getting going on this. There have been attempts to analyze how it happened. That's a lot of what I've read. There's been attempts to kind of figure out, well, why are these people like this, or what's going on with this? But what there hasn't been yet is a real drill down study of these people, the QAnon people themselves, the followers. And that's really hard, obviously, because they don't necessarily present or make themselves very accessible. We don't know who a bunch of them are. They're all anonymous on the boards, online, the originators of this whole thing. But of course, now that it's spilled over into the real world, we've got names and faces and all kinds of things from all of those security cameras that were at the Capitol. But other than that, see, that group of people who engaged in that insurrection was not just QAnon. QAnon was one part. QAnon members were one part of a collective of people who marched on the Capitol. And those people included a whole disparate group of people. The only thing they all had in common was they thought Donald Trump was the bee's knees and he was the guy who was going to save the world. And they had to listen to what he said. And he told them, you go get this Congress and you straighten them out. And they decided they were going to go do that. They built a gallows outside the Congress building as part of that with a noose. They actually hung a noose and a rope. They had gone that far. That was not symbolic, folks. We really can't allow history to be rewritten, especially when it happened this year. We need to be clear about what occurred on January 6th and why it happened. And why it happened is because a megalomaniac, egotistic narcissist named Donald Trump decided to leverage a bunch of deluded people into trying to overthrow the U.S. government. That happened. And I can't think, I only harp on this because I can't think of a more dire consequence other than, say, what Shinrikyo tried to pull off when they, inserted sarin gas into the subway system in Japan and actually killed people and intended to have killed hundreds of thousands of people. They didn't want to kill just a few people. They wanted to kill everybody. That's the only, it's things like that. It's Jim Jones's Kool-Aid drill. It's it's the Waco nonsense. It's these kinds of explosive, violent situations that are the direct, not indirect, direct consequence of this kind of conspiracy-minded nonsense that goes on the internet and in real life. We can't blame the internet for this. This kind of crap was going on before the internet was connected, but the internet has accelerated it. It's basically an accelerant to this kind of extremist thinking, and it creates more extremists in a kind of a whack-a-mole way. And it's us who have to deal with it. And it was bad enough before the internet to try to do interventions and try to get people one-on-one and get them out of these situations. Now we've got hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people deep into extremist headspaces. And they are radicalized people. They are willing to do real-world violence over their delusional beliefs. So this is not just an idle academic exercise at this point, and that's why you see me talking about this with some degree of seriousness. It is serious stuff, and it's stuff we need to be paying attention to. So I think I've accomplished the purpose of my podcast here, which was basically just sort of lay out the fundamentals of what this Q thing is about. I hope you got all this. I hope it all made sense. I hope I communicated clearly. And I would love to know, in response to this podcast, please put in the comment section here on YouTube or at sensiblyspeaking.com what you think about this and what your ideas are about it, and any other questions or things about this that you might want me to talk about, or interview other people who might even be more knowledgeable about some of this. Get them on my show and ask them about it. I want to know what you guys want to know, in other words. So don't be shy. Put that in the comments section to this video, and we will see about doing some more exploring of this topic. All right, guys, thanks very much for coming around and listening to me babble on here. And of course, I do need to say, because I really need to kind of put this plug in more often here on my podcast, I really do need your support financially. It's a thing. And right now, times are tight, and I get that. If every listener to this show really just put in $1 a month on my Patreon, just $1, it would make a tremendous difference to my life and my ability to do the work I need to do in order to get you guys even better content. Okay? So that's my pitch. I hope you guys are willing to help me out and throw some love my way via Patreon. Like I said, even $1 a month, not a big deal probably for you, but if enough of you guys were to do that, it would make a tremendous difference to me. All right. Thanks a lot, guys. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.